Tonight, we walk the last mile with America's most notorious killers. Minutes before the switch flips, the plunger drops, the curtain opens. A born-again pickaxe murderer whispering to victims' families. A killer clown smirking through a botched injection. A killer literally skipping to her death in glee. These are the final moments of Killers before the lights go out. On the evening of February 3, 1998, inside the Red Brick Walls unit in Houston, Texas, Karla Faye Tucker stood in a narrow hallway, wrists cuffed, only minutes away from where she would die. She was about to become the first woman executed in Texas since the 1860s, and the first woman anywhere in the United States to face execution in more than a decade. Those who saw her said she didn't seem afraid. One official even remarked that she almost skipped toward the chamber, believing she was about to meet Jesus. 15 years earlier, in June 1983, Tucker and her boyfriend, Danny Garrett, broke into the Houston apartment of Jerry Dean to steal motorcycle parts. They were high and thought the place was empty. It wasn't. What followed was so vicious that even seasoned jurors later said it was almost unbearable to hear. Investigators said Garrett struck Dean in the head with a hammer. Then Tucker, in a frenzy, grabbed a 3-foot pickaxe and drove it into Dean's body to stop what she described as a gurgling sound. But there was another person in the room, Deborah Thornton, asleep in the bed. Tucker turned the weapon on her, swinging until the pickaxe buried itself in Thornton's chest. Later, Tucker bragged about how the killings had aroused her, a confession so disturbing it shocked even hardened detectives and fueled a massive public demand for the death penalty. The next morning, a friend of Jerry Dean's discovered the scene and called the police. Within weeks, detectives had Tucker on tape describing the killings in her own words. She was arrested, charged with capital murder, and in 1984, a Texas jury sentenced her to die. Garrett received the same sentence, but never made it to execution. He died of liver disease in prison in 1993. Tucker, meanwhile, was transferred to the women's death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville. There, she said she picked up a Bible from a prison ministry cart, fell to her knees on the concrete floor, and begged God to forgive her. She later claimed that was the moment her life changed completely. Over the next 14 years, the transformation stunned nearly everyone who followed her case. Guards and chaplains described her as polite, soft-spoken, and steady, nothing like the violent 23-year-old who had entered prison. She spoke openly about her guilt and her faith. While still on death row, she married a prison minister, Reverend Dana Brown, by proxy. Her story drew attention from around the world. Pastors, conservative politicians, and even Pope John Paul II pleaded for her sentence to be commuted to life without parole. The Huntsville warden called her a model inmate. But despite the flood of appeals, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted against clemency at the end of January 1998. Governor George W. Bush announced that the courts had reviewed everything and he would not intervene. On her final day, the state flew Tucker from Gatesville to Huntsville aboard a small Texas prison plane and placed her on death watch. She chose 4 witnesses to stand for her during the execution: her sister, Carrie Weeks, her husband, Reverend Brown, her close friend, Jackie Anen, and Ronald Carlson, whose sister, Deborah Thornton, had been one of the victims. Once an advocate for Tucker's death, Carlson had experienced his own religious conversion and now opposed executions entirely, even for the woman who helped kill his sister. When asked what she wanted for her final meal, Tucker declined the usual spread of comfort food. She requested only a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. Light, simple, and modest. A little before 7 that evening, guards escorted her into the bright green execution chamber at the Walls unit and strapped her onto the gurney. Behind the glass, 2 groups waited, one for her, one for the dead. Reporters stood by, aware that this moment was historic. Behind the glass, 2 groups waited, one for her, one for the dead. Reporters stood by, aware that this moment was historic.
Texas was about to execute a woman for the first time in more than a century, and the world was watching. When the warden asked for her final words, Tucker turned her head toward the families of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton. She apologized, saying she hoped God would grant them peace. Then she told her husband she loved him, thanked the prison staff for their kindness, and said she was about to meet Jesus, that she would wait for everyone in heaven. Moments later, the chemicals began to flow through the IV line. Witnesses said she licked her lips, looked toward the ceiling, and softly hummed as the drugs took hold. Her breathing slowed, her eyes fluttered, and within minutes, she was still. At 6:45 that evening, about 8 minutes after the injection began, Carla Faye Tucker was pronounced dead. She was 38 years old.
Just before dawn on May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy sat alone in a small holding cell inside Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, only a few steps from the room where he would die. He was 52 years old, his last appeal had failed, and after more than 14 years on death row, the countdown had finally reached its end. The guards around him weren't looking at the smiling Chicago contractor who once posed for photos with politicians and entertained children at charity events dressed as a clown. They were looking at the man the world now knew as the killer clown, convicted of taking the lives of more young men and boys than any single killer most Americans had ever heard of. During the 1970s, Gacy prowled the suburbs of Chicago in search of victims, teenage boys and young men who trusted his friendly grin and promises of easy money. He ran a small construction company and often offered quick jobs, cash, or part-time work to lure them in. Once inside his modest ranch-style home in Norwood Park Township near O'Hare Airport, he turned from neighborly to monstrous. He overpowered his victims, assaulted them, and then ended their lives. The nightmare finally unraveled because of a 15-year-old named Robert P. On December 11, 1978, Robert told his mother he was going to talk to Gacy about a potential job. He never came home. Detectives from Des Plaines grew suspicious and began watching Gacy's movements. After securing a search warrant, they tore into his house. On December 21st, they discovered human remains buried under the foundation. By the next morning, Gacy confessed that he had killed around 30 people. He was arrested immediately. Investigators later confirmed that between 1972 and 1978, he killed at least 33 people. Around 24 bodies were buried beneath his own house, packed into the narrow crawl space under the floorboards. The rest he disposed of in a nearby river. Some of those boys were never even identified. In March 1980, an Illinois jury found him guilty of 33 killings, and the judge sentenced him to die for 12 of them. Reporters who were in that courtroom described his calm demeanor. No tears, no remorse, only the same cold arrogance that had carried him for years. That lack of humanity followed him to death row. For over 14 years at Menard Correctional Center, he insisted he'd been framed. He told anyone who would listen that he was the victim of corrupt police and sensationalist reporters, despite the undeniable evidence of bodies pulled from beneath his own home. From his cell, he worked to rewrite his legacy. He set up a paper-minute phone line so curious strangers could hear him talk about his crimes. He sat for hours of interviews with journalists, authors, and even a federal profiler, always trying to twist the story in his favor. He painted garish clown portraits and eerie self-portraits, selling them to collectors outside prison walls. When asked about guilt, he shrugged. He said he felt none. By May 9, 1994, his time had run out. Every appeal had been denied, and Illinois signed his death warrant. Officials transferred him from Menard to Stateville for his final day. In a rare moment of leniency, they allowed him to sit outside on a small patch of grass with family members, a scene witnesses later described as a quiet picnic behind razor wire. That evening, a Catholic priest arrived to perform the last rites. Gacy then ordered his final meal, a bucket of original recipe fried chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, a full pound of strawberries, and a Diet Coke. Even as midnight approached, Gacy refused to show humility. Witnesses described him as irritated and defiant, not fearful or reflective. He claimed his execution would not bring anyone back. He called the act revenge, not justice. He never offered a sincere apology to the families of those he harmed. Outside the prison, nearly 1,000 people gathered behind barricades and police tape. Many cheered and celebrated, wearing shirts that mocked his clown persona with slogans like "No tears for the clown." A smaller group of anti-death penalty protesters held candles, insisting that even a man like Gacy did not deserve execution. Just after midnight on May 10th, guards led him from his holding cell to the execution chamber. He was strapped onto a gurney, while behind a glass partition sat detectives who had dug in his crawl space and the parents of boys who had vanished decades earlier. Illinois used a 3-drug lethal injection, one to induce unconsciousness, one to halt breathing, and the last to stop the heart. The first injection began at about 12:40 a.m., but almost immediately something went wrong. The chemicals began to solidify inside the plastic tubing, clogging the line. Staff had to pull the curtain closed and fix the issue. When the curtain reopened, Gacy's face had turned gray and swollen. The warden asked if he had any final words. In that moment, he stayed true to his character. Multiple witnesses said his last words were, "Kiss my ass." At 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead.